Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, I will say a few words in French, so now is the moment to grab your headphones if you'd like to hear them in English. Mesdames, Messieurs les ministres,
Ministers, ambassadors, media representatives, participants, welcome to you all to this 14th session of the International Economic Forum on Africa. This is a very special meeting as it's the very first time that is jointly organized with our partners, the African Union.
Média Monde.
Our partners, France Média Monde, Financial Times of Africa. You have a program on your seats, and we'll be focusing on social and economic transformation. This is, in fact, one of the major pillars of the strategy set out by the African Union. A couple words on the programs. Mr. Gurria from the OECD, as well as the chairperson of the African Union Commission, will start with keynote speeches. Then we'll move on to Carlos Lopez of the Executive Secretary Economic Commission for Africa, Mariam Mazzini, Mo Ibrahim, and this will be moderated by Shada Islam, Friends of Europe. Then there'll be a round table that will consider the various challenges that different countries of the continent are faced with in light of various internal challenges, but also a turmoil, global turmoil. We'll then have a lunch, followed by a first session that will be working on globalization issues, notably the capacity of African economies to access the global value chain. See how, in fact, Africa can tap into these. Then there'll be another session that will focus more on internal issues, internal challenges. We're talking about the youth bulge, but also about territorial and spatial issues. Finally, closing the forum, there will be closing speeches, and the Prime Minister of Mali, Mr. Moussa Mara, will then deal with integration, the challenge of integration in West Africa. We have very high-level panelists at all our sessions, and I'm very pleased to see that, in fact, that there are many of you here today. A few words on practical issues, housekeeping issues. There will be a lunch that will be served till 1:30, 12 to 1:30, in the hall of the Chateau. In fact, people will bring you there, show you where it is. In the afternoon, a coffee break is scheduled between 3 and 3:30. Interpretation, French, English is available. You have headsets to be found in the little pocket next to your seat or on your seat. Finally, we are looking forward to serious dialogue and interaction over the course of the day. There will be a Twitter platform, and you can certainly take part in that with the hashtag A14. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would now like you to welcome with me today Mr. Angel Gurria, Secretary General OECD, as well as the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Ms. Lamini Zuma. And I will ask them, in fact, to join me here in order to kick off with the opening speeches, please.
J'accueille Madame Zuma.
Ms. Zuma, chairperson, African Union Commission.
J'invite maintenant Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
Secretary General and Mario Pazzini as well will be speaking to us.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is an honor and a great pleasure for me to invite the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Madame Zuma, and the OECD Secretary General Gurria to open this conference and to deliver to us the opening speeches. Therefore, let me now immediately, without any other ado, leave the floor to Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Angel Gurria.
Prime Minister.
By Africa, for Africa, industrialization and integration for inclusive growth. Monsieur le Premier Ministre, Prime Minister Moussa Mara of Mali, Madame Zuma, Monsieur Lopez, Monsieur Ibrahim. Sounds okay, no? Monsieur Ibrahim. Dear Minister, Monsieur le Ministre, Messieurs les ministres, collègues, amis, Messieurs, Mesdames les ambassadeurs auprès de l'OCDE, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the OECD for the 14th International Economic Forum on Africa. Our annual rendezvous with African leaders, where we take stock of progress and challenges and identify ways of working better together. This edition of the forum is called By Africa, for Africa. Our choice of the title underscores the importance of African citizens, African companies, and African governments as drivers of the development process. The OECD is here to support, to listen, to engage, to strengthen this unique partnership with Africa and its institutions. Our partnership continues to grow from strength to strength. I'm pleased to announce that for the first time, this year's forum has been co-organized by the African Union and the OECD's Development Center. And by the end of today, our cooperation will be even stronger. After our remarks, Madame Zuma and I will sign a memorandum of understanding that will provide a framework for deeper collaboration on issues such as tax revenue statistics, natural resource-based development, and global value chains. We have just added some work about taxes. As you know, we have been working a lot on avoiding tax evasion and tax elusion, both at the level of individuals, with eliminating the tax havens and with the rule of nowhere to hide, but also to make sure that everybody pays their fair share, including the multinationals, where we just delivered to the G20 our work on what we call the anti-BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting. So the anti-base work, and we have just been told that that also has to do, Madame Zuma has said that this would probably be a good thing to take a hard look at in our deliberations and in our joint work. And the Prime Minister and Mr. Ibrahim, Mr. Lopez have said that this is perhaps a productive area where we can get to work. So we will. Now, the African continent has the youngest population in the world. It is experiencing rapid urbanization, the emergence of new types of consumers, and the spread of mobile technologies. All of these changes are opening up huge development opportunities. They're raising people's demands for quality jobs, for better public services, for a cleaner environment, and for more accountable governments. These changes are transforming African economies and African societies for the better. The continent's output has grown on average at about 5% per year between 2001 and 2012. These are, Madame, these are numbers which, of course, produce a lot of envy when you mention them in the OECD context. That's twice the rate of the 1990s of Africa itself, 3 times the average of the OECD economies. On average, in this period, the growth of the OECD economies was 1.7. You're talking about over 1%, so it's 3 times. Growth in sub-Saharan Africa alone is projected at around 5.8% in 2014, with the fastest expansions foreseen in East and West Africa. Although, of course, these projections may have to be revised depending on how fast and how well we can control the impact of the Ebola outbreak. External financial flows are expected to surpass $200 billion in 2014, 4 times the level at the turn of the millennium. Foreign investment in Africa is now fully recovered and projected to reach 80 billion out of those 200 billion. The rest are, of course, other types of flows, including credit. But despite the strong growth, living standards in sub-Saharan Africa have improved less than in other developing regions. Many countries remain vulnerable to volatile commodity markets, climate change, and conflict. I returned only a week ago from the UN Climate Summit in New York and, of course, some meetings of the General Assembly. It's truly shocking that Africa is the region that is most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Yet it represents less than 4% of the world's CO2 emissions from the consumption of energy and less than 7% of total emissions. Talk about, what do they call them, ancillary damage or collateral damage, that means Africa is not doing this to itself. Others are doing this to Africa. And clearly that has to be considered in the equation where we're looking hard at the deals that we're going to be striking this year and next year as we prepare for Paris 2015 and the COP21. Vulnerability to epidemics is another major risk. The Ebola is an example. It's a stark reminder, actually, with its tremendous human and economic costs. Our thoughts are with those people, those communities, and those countries that have been affected. The Ebola crisis needs an immediate, large-scale response, but also underscores quite how important investment in health systems is, if we are to avoid seeing history repeat itself. Like climate change, the question of addressing the health systems is a global challenge that needs a global response. Now, despite living in what is almost a cliche now, saying that we live in an interconnected world, in the globalized world, productivity levels in Africa remain low, and there are too few, and I will use ILO language, too few decent jobs. Every month, 1 million young people become available to join labor markets in Africa. 1 million every month. But only part of them, sometimes only a fraction of them, can actually find a job. Even fewer find themselves in good quality jobs, which take full account of the qualification of these young men and women. New economic opportunities must emerge to meet the needs and expectations of the growing youth bulge. The key question for us today is, what can we do to help create these opportunities? Integration into global value chains can bring widespread benefits to African nations. The OECD's work shows the changing nature of trade and investment. Splitting up the production of goods and services across countries offers opportunities for firms to specialize in specific tasks and draw their value added. You don't need to develop a whole product, meaning from A to Z, from scratch, in order to benefit from these global value chains. Actually, this year's African Economic Outlook, here, it's a handsome edition here. Mario, this is published in French and in Portuguese, right? And of course in English, yeah. It's about global value chains and Africa's industrialization. It is the 13th edition, Mario? 13th edition. Once again, the fruit of our collaboration with the African Development Bank, the UNDP, and the United Nations Economic Commissions for Africa. Carlos Lopez is with us today. We thank him. And the European Union, which helps us with funding and support in order to put this together. I don't know if the ambassador of the European Union, I think I saw her come in. There you are. Thank you very much for your support, and the representatives of the European Union. Without all of you, this, of course, would not be possible. Now, this document this year highlights some promising examples of this global value chain phenomenon. Ranges from garments to footwear manufacturing to horticulture and the whole range of agribusiness. But also reminds us of some of the deep-rooted problems that hinder productivity and in turn hamper job creation. Africa's role in global value chain remains limited. Although this is the new way of organizing production in the world, Africa has not been fast enough to join in this new way of organizing production. About 85% of the trade in value added takes place within the regional blocks of East Asia, Europe, and North America. Africa's share has increased only very slightly from 1.4 to 2.2% in the last, the last 15 years, 16 years. We speak of Factory Asia. But I look forward to the day when we can also speak of Factory Africa. So, what can we do to make it happen? Well, first, we believe we should continue to find better ways of facilitating trade. Our estimates suggest that a comprehensive trade facilitation reform would lower trade costs by as much as 17% in sub-Saharan Africa. That is the area of the world where there's more promise in terms of reducing the costs of doing business, the cost of trade. And every 1% of cost reduction brings billions of benefits in terms of overall to the region. We should also look more closely at how to make the most of expanding African markets. Exports within Africa have higher value added than exports to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is demanding commodities. But within Africa, clearly there's a potential, because it does imply a greater level of integration. Despite this, Africa has the lowest share of intra-regional trade. It's better connected in many ways with Europe or with China or with the United States, etc., than with itself. I am Mexican, as many of you know, and we have had this problem in Latin America for a long, long time. We've been trying to integrate for 50 years. And sometimes we have all these free trade agreements with the US and with Europe, etc., more than with the region of Latin America itself. So I'm quite familiar with these efforts and this phenomenon. A vast improvement in Africa's transport infrastructure is needed. Actually, 3 years ago was it that you dedicated the African Economic Outlook to the transport infrastructure networks in Africa. Second, we need to sustain and deepen efforts to reform public institutions. In any country, entrepreneurs are most likely to thrive in environments with little or no corruption, where governments are transparent and they're accountable. I should stress that these are not only African challenges, they're global ones. In OECD countries, a Gallup World poll suggests that on average, only 4 out of 10 citizens have confidence in their governments, which, as you can imagine, makes it twice as hard to sell any policies that you try to put in place. Third, we need to make sure that Africa seizes fully the opportunities offered by new technologies. These can and should be a driver of both progress, but also of the right type of progress. And here I'm talking about green growth in particular. They offer an opportunity to leapfrog, to forge ahead of those regions and countries that are locked into outdated carbon-intensive technologies. It seems that this revolution may already be underway in some countries. One recent estimate suggested that more renewable energy projects would be commissioned in sub-Saharan Africa this year than in the past 14 years put together. Let me repeat that because it is very dramatic. One recent estimate suggested that more renewable energy projects would be commissioned in sub-Saharan Africa this year than in the past 14 years put together. Something is indeed happening. Now, as a former Minister of Finance myself, I know that putting in place the right policies is not always easy, but there's good news. There's no copyright on good policies. Actually, we at the OECD, we're a clearinghouse of good policies, and we don't charge for the privilege of passing them on. Countries can and should learn one from another, and this is precisely why the OECD will continue to step up its collaboration with African countries and African institutions. Last year, from this podium, Prime Minister Duncan of Côte d'Ivoire asked us to help him design a strategy that would make his country an emerging economy by 2020. That's just, he just said that. He said, how do I become from a developing to an emerging economy? Senegal then followed with a request for support in the implementation of their Plan Sénégal Émergent. Actually, President Macky Sall and I co-signed an op-ed to that effect. And I think today we have the Minister of Finance of Senegal with us today, or we'll have him a little later. Togo asked for our advice in designing a more effective education and training system. And as you know, of course, with a PISA test, we are the leader in the world in terms of the efficiency or the relative efficiency of education systems. Now, I'm proud to say that we've kept our promises. Our development center has embarked on a multidimensional review of Côte d'Ivoire, the first in Africa, and we expect to start working with Senegal in the near future. Other projects are advancing well too. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's almost, again, a cliche to say that no size fits all, but every time my speech writers write no size fits all, I fire them because it's such a, so much used phrases, they said. But they tried hard, they say no silver bullet, so I have not yet threatened them that I will fire them if they put this one here. But it is true. We can do much more together as partners, as equals, to promote better policies for better lives in Africa. Thank you very much. Now, let me give the floor to Madame Zuma of the African Union Commission. And again, let me just remind you all, this event is being co-sponsored and hosted by the African Union and the Development Center of the OECD. Madame.
Well, thank you very much. As you were speaking, I thought maybe there was no need for me to speak. you said most of the things that needed to be said. But let me greet you, Your Excellency Angela Curia, Secretary General of OECD, the Excellency Mr. Musa Mara, Prime Minister of the Republic of Mali, Excellencies, distinguished ministers, Dr. Carlos Lopez, my brother from ECA, Commissioner Marupeng, Commissioner for Economic Affairs. I see my brother Mo there, Ibrahim, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, I'm honored to speak at this 14th International Economic Forum on Africa, more especially because it's the first time I actually come to this dialogue, and to have this dialogue on the transformation of Africa through industrialization and inclusive growth. But maybe just to look back, it says we approach the end of the last millennium. The major debates were about changing the course of Africa after the 2 dead decades for development. These 2 dead decades not only saw serious erosion of peace, democracy, good governance, and stability, but also the erosion of the African capacity for economic planning and industrial policy implementation, stagnation and declining investments in education, in research and development, low levels of investment in agriculture, in infrastructure, and actually so deindustrialization, declining growth and rising levels of poverty and underdevelopment. So the millennium debates amongst Africans thus culminated in the adoption of NEPAD as a new socio-economic development plan for the continent, a renewed drive for peace through the African Peace and Security Architecture, and the launch of the African Union in 2002, which brought together the mandates of political unity, self-reliance, OEU Charter, and economic self-determination, and integration of the Abuja Treaty. As Africans, therefore, when we celebrated our 50 years since the founding of the OAU, now AU, in 1963, it was very important for us to look clearly at the past and ask ourselves what happened in the past 50 years. And of course, the core reason for the OAU, maybe there were 2 core reasons, I'll only mention one. That one was to decolonize Africa, because at the time of 1963, a lot of our countries, including my own, were still under colonial rule. So the OAU put a lot of effort into decolonizing Africa. And of course, 50 years on, we can say that they succeeded. The OAU succeeded in decolonizing Africa. And that's why we now have to say the mandate of our forebearers was to decolonize Africa. What is ours? They fulfilled their mandate. What is ours, and how are we going to fulfill it? And of course, ours is to transform Africa into a modern continent, a continent with economic growth, a continent that is prosperous, a continent whose people will enjoy a reasonable standard of living, like many other continents. So that's the mandate we are giving ourselves. to integrate the continent, make sure the continent is peaceful, people-centered, prosperous, and of course can take its rightful place in the world, because I don't think we can say we have a rightful place in the world. I'm not sure what place we have, but we're working towards that. That's the mandate we have given ourselves. And how are we going to fulfill this mandate? So we decided that as part of our celebration, we must look at 50 years on. What will our grandchildren and our children say about Africa in 50 years? And how do we build that Africa that we want, and we want our children and our grandchildren to describe? So we embarked on a process which we called Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. But we went about it in a maybe not so intellectual way as OECD does. We went to our citizens in their different sectors: business, women, youth, students, artists, workers, and said, what is the Africa you want? Where should Africa be in 50 years, and how do we build that Africa? And they gave us very good ideas. And then we looked at the national plans of our member states, and we got a good idea of where they want to go as governments. And we're merging both the ideas from the citizens and from the governments to come up with the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. And we thought it was important to do that, not to, of course, we also involved experts and so on, but we thought it was important to involve our people, our citizens, because the Africa we want cannot be achieved only by governments. It has to be built by everybody, and so it has to be owned by everybody. So, ladies and gentlemen, of course, industrialization, the need for industrialization and integration of the continent has been a constant from everybody who contributed. But it has always also been a Pan-African aspiration. This has crystallized over the last decade in the agreement on industrialization targets and strategies required to achieve this objective. Amongst other things, we agreed that the processing, adding value, and mineral beneficiation of at least 30 to 40% of Africa's raw material through targeted sectorial and commodity strategies, the creation of specialized institutions, and the development of regional value chains for each sector, and thus increasing the share of manufacturing to 20 to 30% of the GDP. Now, you correctly said that this growth in Africa, that is an envy to the OECD, does not translate into jobs, and it does not translate into the eradication of poverty. And from a perspective of a person like me, who's not an economist, my answer to that is that, of course, it will not, because we export the jobs with the raw materials. Because when you export raw materials, you export the high-level jobs. And you export the revenue that comes from finished products. So it's not rocket science. Why it's not translating into jobs and translating into elimination of poverty amongst our people. So if we are to change that, it means a part of our raw material must be beneficiated and value added on the continent. That's our view. And of course, increasing intra-African trade to between 30 and 40%, with trade in manufactured goods, at least 50% of our intra-African trade through accelerated and integrated infrastructure development, harmonization, and regulatory environment, of the regulatory environment, and the creation of the regional and continental free trade areas. Of course, we have to do this value addition and beneficiation, but to move the goods amongst ourselves, to increase trade, of course we need infrastructure. And we need world-class infrastructure, which we have to build ourselves. We have to try and get investments, but we have to build that world-class infrastructure. And we have to use new technologies, because there's no point going back to where the Industrial Revolution started. We have to start where we are now, using the technologies that are available. Of course, besides infrastructure, the infrastructure is not only about trade amongst ourselves, it's also about integration of the continent, because we can't integrate ourselves if you can't drive from one country to the next, or if you don't have rail connection from one country to the next, or if you don't have a flight from one country to the next. You can't talk about integration, you can't talk about trade. So infrastructure is absolutely critical for that. And of course, difficult as it may be, we have to work towards having Africa as one aviation market. It's not going to be easy, but we have to work towards it, because the benefits from that are enormous. We have to, of course, ensure that rail on our continent is there, highways are there, and when it comes to rail, we have to get to what is available, high-speed rail on the continent, so that we indeed can move the goods amongst themselves, the people can move. And of course, we have to mobilize public and private investments, build institutional capacity, which I think our cooperation will also be very helpful in, both building the institutional capacity, but also mobilizing investments and making sure that we have the capacity to implement our industrial policies. Because I don't think Africa is short of policies. I think we have policies. We just need to implement. That's where the problem is. These are our targets, but we also have to have a fair idea of what to do, and to some degree, given the lessons from our own experience, but also from the experiences of others. The fact that this important annual International Economic Forum on Africa and forums and reports of the AU, UNECA, ADB, and of African think tanks of at least the last 3 years have been dedicated to this issue of industrialization bears further testimony to how important we take this, but also that we have deliberated on it. Now we need to do. For me, that's what is remaining. It's not the policies, it's not the think tanks, it's the doing. So I hope that the discussions today will concentrate more on how to do, because for me, that is what is lacking. And of course, I will just mention a few areas which I think are key Agriculture is one of them. I think it's the scandal of the 21st century that Africa is still a net importer of food. I think we should be a net exporter of food. And hopefully, discussions will center around what needs to be done, both to increase our productivity, but also the agro-processing and developing our agribusiness. A lot is happening, but not enough to change from being a net importer to a net exporter. Minerals, I won't say a lot about that. We know Africa possesses almost all the minerals that are needed in the world, but it exports them raw, and sometimes when they come back as finished products, we can't afford them. So that also needs to change. And we are very excited about what Botswana is doing with its diamonds, and I hope that this can become a regional or a continental hub for diamonds. You also mentioned about ICT and how important that is. Of course, our citizens, because they did not need government, once government opened up the ICT industry, our people bought the technology. And so they've shown us that they embrace technology, and we need to do that. But we can't do that unless we have skilled people. So I'm very happy. I agree with you in terms of education, but I think we need to focus a lot more on STEM because that's where we are lacking on science, technology, engineering, research, maths. So, and I hope we can touch on that and how to strengthen the STEM areas, the STEM area in our education. I also think that we need to strengthen, of course, our institutions generally of learning, lower and higher, our universities. But again, I think we should look at how we can use technology to expand that space, because the physical buildings that we have will never give us enough skills that are needed. So we need to extend that physical space through virtual space using technology to train many more of our young people. So I hope the discussions will also touch on that and see how practically we can work together on that. And of course, there are lots of good examples in Africa where we can maybe see how we can upscale. If you take the cotton industry, Egypt is a very good example of what they do with their cotton. We can look at the Shongai farms in Benin and see what best practice we can learn from that. But I think the important thing is the political determination around our domestic resource mobilization and around implementing our industrial strategies and policies. And so we need to link infrastructure development, industrialization, using technology. And it's true what you said about energy. We need a lot of energy, but a lot of countries are looking at renewable energies. As you know, there's a corridor of clean energy that has been established by 22 countries, right from Egypt down East, Southern Africa. And a lot is also happening in West Africa. Biomass, hydro, solar, wind, So that is happening, and we need to just make sure that we encourage that and we support it. And I think because I think as Africans, we realize that we have to embrace and leapfrog using new technologies. And of course, I just want to again repeat that for us, the real challenge is about implementation and finding practical solutions to industrialize. And so these discussions hopefully can be as practical as that. So the dialogue that we are going to is going to open a debate and hopefully creative policy solutions, but more so practical solutions on how to implement the policies that exist, and policy analysis, monitoring and development of statistical indicators to facilitate research and dialogue on questions impacting on development strategies in Africa, the capacity building, including staff exchanges and publications, participation of the OECD policy dialogue and natural resource-based development, and the OECD initiative on global value chains, production, transformation, and development. And so we look forward to strengthening this relationship and look forward to sharing a lot of what we do in order to advance the industrialization. But of course, we also need to look at social issues, as has been seen through Ebola, social infrastructure, health infrastructure, institutions, because today we would be a bit more confident if Ebola wasn't on our continent, because the 3 countries that are affected were countries which were were turning the corner from having had conflicts and so on, and they were doing well. And it hurts us that now their development is going to be, we've seen the economies revising, even their GDPs down for the year. So it's something that tells us that going forward, health and education is essential for economic growth as anything else. And without health and education, actually, you cannot sustain development. But what we need now is to mobilize not all African countries, and we are doing that. And of course, the world, we are encouraged that we have seen the world pledging, and we've seen on the ground Americans and others building infrastructure. But what we can see is still a gap on the human resource side in these countries, because they don't have enough health personnel. Some of the health personnel has succumbed to the disease. So Cuba, we have seen they are bringing personnel, which is good. As Africans, we are also mobilizing Africans to go and work on these areas. We started with Liberia, and in fact, that experience, because we've been there almost for a month now, has shown us that that is really essential to bring personnel. And we're going to be bringing more in Sierra Leone and Guinea, but we need more human resources in order to really break the cycle of Ebola. The infrastructure is welcome because it's needed, but the infrastructure alone is not going to solve the problem. We need human resources. But again, thanks. I'm glad that we are now partnering in this way, and hopefully we can move far together. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a great pleasure for me to invite now the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Madame Zuma, and the OECD Secretary General Gurria to take place for the official signature of the Memorandum of Understanding between our two institutions. Now, while they take a seat, let me stress the importance of this agreement, which is part of our action plan for Africa, a strategy to strengthen the relations between the OECD, its development center, and the key actors in Africa. Today is the beginning of a common journey. We join hands with the key African institutions to support them in implementing the priorities, as was said by Madame Zuma, that they have agreed to offer a better future to African citizens. Few words about the concrete actions in the Memorandum of Understanding, the development of comparable tax revenue statistics, and tools for inclusive fiscal policy for Africa. I think that Mo Ibrahim will be particularly happy of this subject. The exchange of policy experiences to maximize natural resource-based development and for engaging in global value chains and promoting production transformation. As you know, we are finished. And therefore, join the organization of the forum. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Voilà. Ibrahim, Carlos, if you want to join for the photo. And the Prime Minister of Mali, obviously. Sì, ma non tiene il tempo.
Mesdames et messieurs, maintenant nous allons...
Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary General will be leaving us now. We will bid him farewell, and I'd like to invite the panelists for the first session to come up onto the podium so that we can begin the first substantial session this morning, and it relates to the social and economic transformation program of Africa. Shada Islam will be moderating this panel. She's been kind enough to come in from Brussels, from Friends of Europe. And once again, this year, she will be moderating the roundtable. Over to you, Shada.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored and delighted to be chairing this panel, to be moderating this panel. I have the luck of having 4 very distinguished speakers, people who not only have a very profound and in-depth knowledge of Africa, but are working, as Mrs. Zuma said, to actually improve things and change things in Africa. Hello, Mr. Romano Prodi, welcome here as well. I know you from the European Commission days. It's a pleasure to have you here. So just a few words before I turn over the microphone to my friends here. Like many others, I and the think tank where I work, Friends of Europe, we're excited, Madam Zuma, to be part of this new emerging narrative about Africa. I've been a journalist for many years, and now I'm an analyst, and I have to confess to a strong frustration at the very negative and partial story about Africa that's been told across the world. and especially in the West. And so to be part of a new emerging narrative about Opportunity Africa, about the positive things happening in Africa is extremely, extremely exciting for us. Today in this panel, we have about 2 hours, in fact, so we're really lucky. We can explore different facets of Africa's economic transformation and the reality of this transformation, the challenges and the opportunities. Now, Mrs. Zuma, in her keynote speech this morning, gave us an array of ambitions, goals, plans that you at the African Union have. And I think we can really say there are 3 key points that we need to look into in slightly more detail. First of all, how do we accelerate and deepen Africa's structural transformation? What public policies are needed to go beyond poverty alleviation and reduction, and to talk about building, to act about building inclusive and cohesive societies? And the whole issue of inequalities and what policies are needed to generate growth, as Mr. Gurria said, decent jobs for people. So that's my 2 pennies worth. I'm going to now turn the floor to our panelists, and actually I'm going to start with Mr. Mo Ibrahim from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. This morning, Mrs. Zuma, as I said, gave us a whole list of ideas and plans, and she said it's important now to do, not just to think. Your foundation is doing exactly that. You're talking about the very practical steps that need to be taken. And the one issue, Mo, that you focus on is good governance. You have an index, and recently your report said, not too bad. We're moving ahead. Give us a little bit more insight into what your plans are and what your thinking is, Mo. Thank you.
Thank you, Shada. Yes, I fully agree with what our chairperson, Madam Zuma, have just said. It's really about delivery now. We talked policy for such a long time. Everybody knows what is needed. It's a question of execution and delivery. In our foundation, we produce this annual index of governance. And last Monday, a week ago, we had our press conference to introduce our annual governance report. For people who are not familiar with that, we measure about 134 parameters. They come under 94 indicators, summed up into 4 key areas. And that's where the governance rests on. Governance, for us, is about the delivery of this basket of public goods. And it rests, as I said, on 4 legs. One is security and rule of law. You cannot have a civilized society without rule of law and security for its citizens. Second leg is economic peace, which is sustainable economic development, which talk about infrastructure and public management of funds, accountability, etc. This has roads, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. The third leg is the human development, which Madam Zuma talked about, education, health, etc. That's the software, which really matches the hardware, which is the economic piece. The fourth one is, of course, the participation, human rights, etc. These are the 4 legs of governance. And all this are measured. So we really trying to move to a discourse where we're talking data and facts, not emotions or shouting or slogans. We had enough of slogans. So we really are very precise in measuring all these things. What the measurements show us is that we are moving forward, not as fast as we would like to. And we compared the progress over the last 5 years with the progress over the previous 5 years. And we found that we continue overall to move forward in terms of governance, but the drivers for governance in Africa in the last 5 years have changed from the previous 5 years. In the previous 5 years, that's from 05 to 09, the driver really was the economic growth. between 09 and 013, the biggest improvement, really, the driver for the overall improvement in governance was actually, surprise, surprise, is not economic growth, but it is participation and human rights. This is really improving our governance in Africa, which is really also interesting. We are a little bit worried because one area we have deteriorated over the last 5 years is that area of conflicts. Conflicts in Africa have changed. We look at the early measurements, 2000, etc., because we have data for 14 years. The conflicts change in their nature. In the past, it was mostly conflicts across borders. At the moment, we don't have any conflicts across borders, but we have few conflicts within border, inter-country conflicts. And this phenomena started really to grow in various places in Africa. And I don't know if people who are following us, last year, we issued a warning about the rising of violence and armed conflicts within countries. And we said, why this is happening? A number of interpretations, possibly marginalization of certain groups of people, possibly inequality, possibly fault lines on societies across religious or ethnic or whatever other divisions. And we urged the African leaders and the African people to really pay attention to what is happening that's really affecting our society.
Oh, just a very quick follow-up to what you've said. Can you actually name a few countries who you think have performed better than others? And is there enough pressure on governments that are lagging behind to actually try and catch up with those that are moving forward?
Yes, it is interesting. The best performing countries actually came from the bottom of the table. We noticed that Cote d'Ivoire is improved a lot. Sierra Leone, Niger, they have really improved. We have to take that also with a pinch of salt, because countries coming out of conflicts, once they come out of conflicts, they improve quite quickly. I mean, like last year, Liberia and Sierra Leone were really the stars, and because they just come out of very bad place, they moved a lot. The one interesting thing is the best performers, which historically have been the best performers for the last 15 years. These countries are South Africa, Botswana, Mauritius, Cape Verde, and Namibia. And all these guys continue to do better. They dominate the top. They keep these positions. But at least in one basic legs of this four-legged governance approach, they are slipping. And so we issue also a warning that even the guys who are doing very well, please watch out and don't think that the job is done. So we hope that you keep improving in all elements of governance.
So no room for complacency or smugness. You have to stay vigilant, stay ahead of the game. Thank you very much indeed, Mo. I'll come back to you, and I'm sure we have many questions for you. I'd like to turn now to Carlos Lopez. He's Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. And actually, I've had the pleasure of hosting you in Brussels, Carlos. So it's a pleasure to see you again. Now, one of the things that Mrs. Zuma has referred to as well is what we could call the puzzling paradox of Africa. There is growth. We've seen the figures. They're quite impressive, at times very impressive. But we aren't seeing jobs being created. We aren't seeing the building of equal societies. And one of the things that you say in your latest report, Carlos, is that one way to the future is industrial policies. And I was wondering if you could give us some insight into why have you said this? Why is industrial policy a bit of a silver bullet, if you like, for Africa?
Well, thank you, Shada. I think when we start talking about structural transformation, of Africa, and you have mentioned that yourself in your introduction. 2 years ago, it was not a forbidden expression, but it was not really with the overall understanding that this was profound and meant much more than just, you know, a gimmick. Today, everybody talks about structural transformation in Africa. Everybody talks about industrialization. This is a 2-year-old proposition, and it's already completely taken by everybody. I would say everybody because there are some resistance coming from Bretton Woods institutions that prefer diversification of economies rather than industrialization. So the debate is still going on, but I think overall this has been accepted. And it has been accepted because there is a realization that the market fundamentals for Africa are so strong that industrialization is almost an obvious next step. But let's pause for a minute. We have been deindustrializing, as Madame Zuma said. In fact, we lost about 2% of our value manufacturing addition in the last 10 years. So instead of industrializing, we are going the other way. And that is basically because most of our growth has been produced by internal consumption first. That means strong demand for services and also consumable goods, middle class that is rising. And of course, our exports benefiting from commodity prices and commodity demand. And that we have been exporting raw. Take just the example of coltan, my preferred example. So coltan produces tantalum and columbite, which are the ingredients that we need for our cell phones and smart phones and all the rest and tablets. Everybody in the world is after one or already has one. And we in Africa control 80% of the production. But we export it raw and we don't benefit more than about $400 million of all this wealth. Now, I would say that we can shut down the world because you can't operate without cell phones and tablets. We can shut down the world. And yet, you know, we benefit $400 million, which is really peanuts. So if you just take this example and you can multiply it in so many ways, you can see that the proposition from Madame Zuma is basically something that we can no longer pass. This has become a scandal. We just cannot pass exporting jobs. And I think we have to fight in different fronts. One of them is perceptions about Africa. We have the best return on investment, 9% equivalent to an average of about 7% for the rest of the world. We have a lot of ingredients that will be absolutely essential for propelling growth in the future. And yet this is not happening fast enough, and it's not happening mostly because Africa is not being used still as a propeller for industrialization of a different type, because we have the benefits of being a latecomer. Latecomers don't do things like the others. They can leapfrog, and they have conditions of learning from what has happened in other regions. So as latecomers, we have a number of advantages in our pocket that we have to use now and have to transform industrialization in our entry point. One last word, because I can't resist, on Ebola. You see, Ebola is striking 3 countries. 3 countries that represent less than 1% of Africa's economy. Nobody's talking anymore about the 99%. Everybody is just talking about this 1%. Thank you.
Alice, if I could just have a quick follow-up. Also, your report talks about IPOs, industrial policy organizations that have to be set up. Is that because you feel that the market is not enough to do this? What kind of IPOs would you, they'd have to be very flexible, they'd have to be tailor-made. Is that a realistic proposition given the vastness of Africa and the vastness of Africa's challenges?
Shada, we are not saying that it has to be the same industrial policy for the entire continent. We are saying this has to be tailor-made country by country. But there are a certain number of characteristics that are common for all African countries. Let me just mention a few. First, we are not going to do import substitution industrialization. That was possible when it was done in Latin America, but this is over. It's not a niche that is available to us anymore. We are not going to do mass production a la Asian model either, because that type of production, well, part of it is interesting for us, because when you start industrialization, you normally start with agro-processing, and you also start with low value addition base, because, you know, obviously we are not going to start producing, you know, computers. We are going to start producing yogurts, but that's fine, and textiles and so on. But because we have to orient our production towards the internal market as much as for exports, because the real niche for us is the internal market, it's going to be different. Third, we can do green industrialization because we can power our entire industrialization with renewable energy if we wanted. Obviously, you need a mix, you know, depending on market conditions. But we have the potential to do it completely green in terms of energy supply. But even from a technological point of view, because Africa is not married to any particular technological platform, it is possible to leapfrog technologies and just do things in a much more simpler way. The CEO of SAP, one of the biggest software corporate companies, said that he's investing $500 million in Africa for developing new models for the business there. And when he was asked the question, why are you doing it now? His answer was very revealing. He said, we are doing it now because the technology has become fast and simple enough, which means that you can actually leapfrog. It's very easy to do it, and the cell phone situation just confirms it. Africa, with 800 million users of cell phone, is only now second to China in terms of market for cell phones. All other regions and countries have been surpassed. So this shows the potential. And then finally, our industrial policies in common will have the benefit also of practicing, which I'm suggesting should be called smart protectionism in the case of Africa. This is no longer a forbidden word. I have been clobbered for using it many times, but I will continue to use it. Africa has to practice smart protectionism. There is no region in the world that has industrialized without some sort of protectionism. You cannot do it the crude way because the regulatory framework is what it is, and we are no longer, unfortunately, able to do it like others did, where they didn't have all these regulatory frameworks. We are latecomers. We are, in this case, being affected negatively. But this being said, we can outsmart the system in many ways. I just gave you the example of coltan, and there are many others where we really can use the commodities control that African countries sometimes have to have an advantage in value addition. It doesn't make any sense for us to have 60% of the cocoa production in the world and not produce chocolates. I mean, it's not going to be Toblerone, it's not going to be Godiva, but we can produce chocolate paste, which will be used probably by Godiva and Toblerone.
Thank you, Carlos. Smart protection, start protectionism. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. Interesting, intriguing idea. Mario, there were references made this morning to the ambition of creating Factory Asia and Factory Africa, sorry. There is Factory Asia there already, Factory Africa. And obviously, how do you do that if you're not integrating African economies into global value chains? And I was wondering, because your Africa Economic Outlook this year was also about GVCs, I was wondering if you can give us a little bit of a connection on how this happens in Africa's economic transformation.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me say that this message is part of a longer message. As we have been producing the African Economic Outlook for 13 years, now there are some stories that appear within our production. And in fact, this story started with a number that was dedicated to youth. now Africa is the continent with the highest amount of young people, and it will be so for long, up to 2040 at least. The question that we were raising, that is related to the point of Madame Zuma on migration, was what can we do for young people arriving in the labor market, in the north very often being unemployed, and in the south underemployed. And the first answer didn't go on global value chain, but we started discussing the contribution that natural resources can provide to the African economy. And obviously there are some risk of Dutch disease that appear, by the way, not only in Africa, but also in Latin America, in Asia, and in some OECD countries. But we said that we thought that natural resources may be an important source of growth if exploration continue at a rhythm which is higher than the present one. Africa at present is investing 150 per square kilometers of the resources that Australia, for example, is investing in exploration, but in particular by developing linkages. Now, it is clear that this can be an important contribution, but not enough. And therefore, the question goes also to, I don't know if diversification, but for sure, creating a manufacturing basis related or not to the production of natural resources. And here, what can be done? Carlos said already a lot on that matters. But the first instinct in the OECD is to use our software that have been used for 52 years between OECD countries. And is to say, can we learn something in the implementation, as on the implementation, from other experiences? It's a question that came to us also from the president of Costa Rica, Madame Chinchilla. She said, we have been capable to attract Intel at that time, then Intel left, but how can we learn from experiences in Malaysia, for example, or in Tunisia, that we consider to be similar to our experience? And therefore, here comes the help that we may provide. Can we put around the table countries with similar type of contest and question, African or not, and see if some experiences can be drawn? And there are, in fact, some considerations that appear when you do that exercise. For example, we can learn what not to do from the OECD countries. President Prodi, which is here, that wrote some decades ago books about ceramic tails in Italy, experimented directly an experience in observing how small firms can be developed and so on. For example, we know that centralized decisions on industrial policy that are taken only by the governmental actors sometimes present problems because the central actors do not know necessarily what are the opportunities of different places. Here, I would like to go back to what Madame Zuma told us. It's very important to involve many actors in the decision-making, not just the central government. Local authorities, entrepreneurs, unions are crucial actors in identifying what are the opportunities. In this way, 2063 strategy for Africa has been built. Another example that comes to my mind is what we learned from Asia. In Asia, we have observed that it's particularly important to provide incentives for investment in research and development on firms, and also it's very important to provide support to small and medium-sized firms that very often are the subcontractor of large firms, and as subcontractor, they contribute to the quality of the final product. It's crucial to do. But even Latin America, that often is considered to be a continent where industrialization took time to take place. We discussed it with Carlos and Alicia Bárcena exactly here in OECD a few months ago, and we are thinking together to do comparative analysis on industrial policy that have been done in Latin America, in Africa, and in OECD countries. Well, in Latin America, despite all difficulties, what do we observe? We observe that it's very important to provide financial services and resources to small and medium-sized firms. BNDES in Brazil is a development bank that helps the development of small firms. Without this institution, would be extremely difficult for the small firms in that country to intervene. But we have also learned that you can use the resource that come out from natural resources to be reinvested. I will conclude just quoting the example of Colombia. Colombia has decided to use the rent that comes out from royalties and invest them in regional development infrastructure. In all region is Colombia. Now, how do you allocate these funds? How do you implement this expenditure? Is in fact something to be developed further. But it's already interesting, this idea, that you take the resources and then you invest in services at local and regional level, in infrastructure at local and regional level. Let me say that if something I have learned from the work that was done in the region that were observed some years ago by Mr. Prodi, is that very often what small and medium-sized firms need is more real services than incentives or subsidies. It's very important to have information about the market, about the fashion trends. It's very often important to have infrastructure and logistical services, más than incentives that sometimes entrepreneurs do not know where to go and spend, and therefore they reproduce what they have already. These are examples of the thinking that we have developed up to now.
I guess, Mario, one of the key services is actually access to finance as well, obviously, for SMEs. But I wanted to, I find it very intriguing when OECD Development Center talks about cross-fertilization of ideas and experiences between different countries, different regions, different continents. I don't think we do that enough. I mean, Africa can learn from Asia, can learn from Latin America, all of that you've talked about. Who actually does that?
In fact, you are totally right. I would like to compliment South Korea, because South Korea, when was president of the G20, decided to introduce in the work of the working group on development a pillar that was called knowledge sharing. But let me be clear on this point. It can be confused with the idea that we need to do a little bit more dissemination. There are researchers that studies, identify results, and then go around to disseminate what we have learned. I don't think this is knowledge sharing. The real knowledge sharing is when the different actors with their own experience and with equal voices sits around the same table and discuss what to do. I think this has been, for the OECD countries, the role that the OECD has played. Not being a bank is in a certain sense much easier to create those tables. What we are trying to do now is exactly to use this experience with other countries. And you will have noticed that I have done example of countries that are not members of the OECD, because also in this case we can use this experience to facilitate this cross-contamination. There are two examples. Madame Zuma has just signed a memorandum of understanding where we will work with the African Union on two clusters of countries that meets regularly. One are countries specialized in natural resources, and the other are countries that wants to take advantage from global value chain in different phases of the process of production. These are the examples I think you are looking for.
Yes, absolutely. Chairperson Madame Zuma, I left you till the end because I was really fascinated by your speech, your intervention. And I was also very fascinated by this personal email, this rather visionary email from the future that you have sent, and which talks about Africa's development by 2063. You talk about production of chocolate, among other things. You talk about youth. You also talk about women. And I was wondering if you could use this platform here to tell me a little bit, tell us a little bit about the role of women in Africa's economic transformation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very important question because in Africa, like in many countries, the majority of the people are women in Africa. It's youth and women. And just from a practical point of view, if you use half your talent, it means you'll achieve half the development. So it's important for Africa to use all its talents. I think that is obvious. But more than that, the African women over the centuries have been probably the hardest working people on the continent. During this year in Africa is 2014 is the year of agriculture. And during the last summit in June, there was a very vibrant, a very interesting debate by heads of state on what to do on agriculture. And one of them, I think it was the Vice President of Kenya, who said that there is a saying that hard work pays. And he said if that saying was true for the hard work of African women would be billionaires. Because they do work hard. For instance, in agriculture, about 70% of the people working in agriculture are women. And so if we were to just look at how to improve their productivity in agriculture, in this consultation that I was talking about, they've told us what they need. For instance, of course, they can't have much productivity if they have to use the hand hoe to plow the fields. And they've said that if indeed Agenda 2063 is to be achieved, that hoe must move from the field to the museum and be replaced by more modern equipment, which can be used for more productivity, but also that will preserve their own health, because that also creates problems for their health. But if you gave women land, you gave them technology in agriculture, and you gave them access to finance, without involving anybody else, I think we can reverse the trend in Africa, if we just do that for the women in Africa. And of course, if we went further to give them more training, let them do fisheries and do other things, then it would even be more. Because they've done this over centuries, they understand, and if we link them up with universities, there are about 34 universities in Africa that deal with agriculture that have come together to see how they can help, because they had found that the age in agriculture was now, average age was 50. But in the universities, it was also the same. There were no young people coming into masters and doctorates in agriculture. So they came together to see how they can involve young people. But what is unique about what they are doing, they are involving young people, but they are working also practically with the small farmers. So I think that's one area. The second area where women can really play an important role is, obviously, if you skill the young women, just as you skill the young men, especially in science and technology, innovation. I think women, if they have the necessary tools, they'll be very good in innovation, in business. Already, where they've been given the opportunity, they've shown that they can actually do very well in business, in academia, because they also have a special role, because they also socialize young people. So if they are able to socialize young people, encouraging them to be innovators, encouraging them to be skilled in the right way in business, it means that they will be moving the countries forward. So I think women, basically what I'm saying, needs to be in all areas of human endeavor. And if they are, the continent will actually move much faster, deeper and wider.
Thank you very much. I've actually just come back from Rwanda, and I have to say I was really impressed by the energy and vigor of women. It was a meeting of African entrepreneurs, but especially African women entrepreneurs, and it was extremely, extremely energizing to see that. Thank you very much, Ms. Zuma. I'll come back to you with a further question, but I would like to open the floor now to questions from all of you who are here and who've heard us speak for some time now, almost an hour and a half. So if I could have a show of hands of people who would like to ask questions at this stage. Very good. Great enthusiastic response. Right, I'm going to take 3 questions and then turn to the panel for answers. I'll take a question here from the... We have a roving microphone, right? Yes, thank you. The gentleman in the blue here with his hand up. Further, yeah. Please identify yourself. And if I could make a plea for brevity in your question and comment so that the panel, we have some time ahead of us, but I'd still like the panel to come back in with some insightful answers. So please.
Voilà.
Thank you. I think that to think for other people is a good thing, but to think for oneself is better still. If Africa had done just that and thought for itself, I don't think we'd be where we're at today. Now, if Africa is truly interested in modernizing its social cultural context to provide content to these issues, specifically the economic and social environments for itself and by itself, if we work from that assumption, I'd now like to ask a question. You're taking on my role. Absolutely not. You're doing a remarkable job, and I'd like to thank you. So when NEPAD was launched, it was said to the president that the technology transfer must actually work out properly. It was said Dakar, Conakry, Malabo. So technology transfer, tech transfer, in order to actually train local executives and train people locally. Well, if we take stock today, we're still thinking through other people's heads or minds. Ms. Zuma, could you please answer, why has this technology transfer, why this whole issue of training executives and high-level officials or officials so far hasn't borne fruit in our continent? That's the first question. Second question, when we speak of growth, a farmer will say, well, that's all fine and well, but what are you referring to? Growth for whom? I'm having a hard time simply to modernize what I'm doing. So growth, yes, fine, but where and for whom specifically? Are we talking about growth in the market sector, or are we talking about growth for the people? Final question. This is addressed to Mr. Ibrahim. It is all fine and well to say that conflicts are perhaps not as strong today as they were or have been. But if you consider Liberia, Sierra Leone, and many other African countries for that matter, Mr. Ibrahim, I'm speaking to you, you've got Central Africa. And there are other countries as well. I think that it is absolutely essential that you mark your calendars and make sure that you take into account the willingness of Africans to do their own thing, to work this out on their own themselves. I think that the time is now behind us where other people do the thinking for us. It is up to ourselves to do our own thinking. If we carry on that way, nothing's going to happen. We'll go nowhere fast. And finally, at the summit, sir, I think that your time is up now. We will answer your questions. Yes, but this is the main issue here. I've seen all heads of state when they were there at Mandela's funeral. But that's all well, but when I wanted to, in fact, launch an international prize, Mandela Prize for Journalism in Africa, said, no. Well, then fine. In that case, since that's the case, I will use the name of Makeba. So that would be the name of the prize. At least she has not perpetrated any crimes. Quite the contrary. She tried to save us and save us through ourselves and for ourselves. I think your time is off. This is it. Thank you.
Microphone to the gentleman here.
Sorry, I have a microphone here. If it's possible to
Can you just wait your turn,
Okay,
please?
no problem.
I'll give it here first. Thank you. Just down the road. Please, can you be brief and introduce yourself, please?
My name is Miles Muzwiti, and I'm founder and managing director of Pharma Africa. We're a business intelligence company focusing on the pharmaceutical industry in Africa. And I have a couple of questions, one for Madam Zuma and one for Mr. Lopez. You mentioned in your speech that there's no shortage of policies across Africa, and perhaps the problem is execution. I know, obviously, the African Union Commission is working on with a consortium of partners, which I think includes UNECA as well, in Ghana, on implementing the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa. And we are having a conference there in February with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization as part of those activities. My question was, how can African countries design industrial policies to effectively allow for sufficient coordination across the economy and to allow for interdependent sort of complex developments to take place. And I know, Mr. Lopez, you mentioned that import substitution industrialization hasn't worked in Africa, and that we will not do that. And in that context, where do you see the place for competitiveness in the context of industrialization and bringing in protective tariffs and import quotas and things like that?
Thank you very much. Very good question. There was the gentleman who stood up and wanted the floor. So.
I'm here.
Brief again, please. Thank you.
Pas de problème. Donc, je suis Benjamin Gonga.
Benjamin Gonga, International Development for OECD l'Afrique. And I'd like to put a question directed at Ms. Zuma and Mr. Lopez. So far, you've talked about Africa almost as though it sounded like it was a country. Certainly, that is something that is dear to our heart. Nonetheless, we're not there yet. So how can we talk about industrializing Africa, whereas we know that it's very difficult to bring together the 54 countries that comprise Africa? The organization I belong to, I work for, there are 8 entities on the continent: West Africa, Central Africa, South Africa, notably. And it's already hard at that level to make sure and ensure that there's some sort of consistency and come up with speak of a single voice. Ms. Zuma.
To develop this industrialization you are calling for, is it regional strategy? Is it a continental strategy? And how do you involve the youth in this strategy? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There was a lady who put up her hand there. Yes, please. Could you take the microphone there, please?
Oui. Simon Tedga.
Simon Tedga.
Floor. I'm going here now, and we'll come back to you. Please.
Bonjour, je m'appelle
Régine Giletios. I'm a legal specialist pertaining to work integration, and I also belong to an association that works on youth and employment issues. I'd like to thank Ms. Zuma, more particularly. I think that she has drawn a clear link throughout her speech between, on the one hand, industrialization and skills on the other. Clearly, industrialization cannot happen without having skills at the ready. I fully share Ms. Zuma's point of view as to the role of developing skills and qualifications in order to make sure that industrialization can happen in order to develop Africa, the entire continent. I'm wondering if the next OECD forum couldn't in fact focus on developing skills development in Africa. If this is not focused on, if we don't actually work on this very issue, working on skills development in Africa, I'm concerned that it might take decades, even centuries, to get ahead. Once the time has come to deal with things and to move along, to industrialize, we have to make sure that we have the skills at hand. Without the skills, it's not going to happen. There's also the youth bulge. We really need to work on the proper skill development in young people. Without that, we're not going to move ahead.
To give, s'il vous plaît, madame, excusez-moi.
Please, I have to ask a question. 2 seconds. 2 seconds. It has to do with Ebola. We'll get back to Ebola. I also have a question on Ebola. That's the second round. We'll get back to that, rest assured.
Panel. And starting with Mo, there were some questions for you as well. Would you like to come in now?
I don't believe there's any question. And there's no question. Sorry, there was no question. There was a very long monologue from the gentleman here.
Mo, it was about how Africans have to think for themselves. That was one question for you. The other one was about the execution of policies that Mrs. Zuma talked about as well, whether you think governments are actually implementing what they promise. If those two questions you could deal with.
Okay, concerning the execution of the policies, I think we need to hold governments accountable. The problem is, yes, we all know what needed. We all know what the policies are. And the question of implementation. I mean, fine, we talk about integration, industrialization. How can we industrialize factory? You know, Carlos, you said our internal market will be the first market. How can you have an internal market if you don't have a single market in Africa? If the goods cannot move from A to B, how can you have a single market? So, single market controlled by what? Controlled by rules introduced by governments, ratified by parliaments to allow freedom of movements of people and goods and capital. This is not happening. So here, where is the bottleneck here? The bottleneck is the African leaders, the political leaders of the individual countries. They go to Addis Ababa, they sign up on an agreement, they go back home and they don't do it. And it is time to make everybody accountable. If they sign an agreement, they do it. Because otherwise, we just keep talking for the next 50 years to the year 2063 about integration, single market, industrialization, and still are unable to trade with each other. Still, it's cheaper to get products from China to West Africa than getting products from East Africa to West Africa. So forget it. So until we have actions, and these actions have to be taken by our leaders, and we need to hold their hand to the fire. Okay, either they are serious or not serious.
But Mo, is it too visionary to talk? The gentleman there said there is no Africa. There are many African countries. Is it too visionary to talk about an African path?
It is not visionary. It just we need to be realistic. We know we cannot talk about African unity now. I would have loved to have the United States of Africa. Many Africans would have loved that. But we know it is difficult. We have different political entities, different cultures even within Africa, different languages, etc. But what we can do is a single market. Why the Germans, the Finns, the Norwegians, the British, the Spanish, all those guys can have a single market, and we African cannot have a single market? I think that is a practical thing we can do and is doable. As an African, if you want to visit another African country, it is difficult. You need 2, 3, 4 weeks to get a visa if you can. If you carry a French or British passport, you just walk through. That's shameful. So if you are afraid from each other as Africans, you will stop your people, you stop your goods, then what are you talking about? What is this Africa talking about? Where is the unity in the African Union? Okay, so we talk about things which we don't do, and that is a problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mo. Carlos, there were some questions put to you, including on implementation of industrial policy.
Thank you, Shada. Well, let me start with where Mo left on the integration. Well, by 2017, there is this proposal for an integrated market in Africa. This is as trade is concerned. What is evolving in the discussion is the principle that instead of waiting for everybody to be ready to move with the ones that are ready. Because this is not going to happen if you want to integrate in one go 54 countries. And that's not the way Europe integrated, the example that you were giving. You know, there are different speeds in Europe, and that's exactly what is going to happen in Africa. Right now, the discussion is pretty advanced in East African community. And by the way, the statistics about trade in Africa are very misleading. They are misleading in three ways. First, they don't take into account that integration is higher in certain sub-regions than others. Actually, the statistics about 13% intra-Africa trade are brought down because of North Africa, that has the least integration of all. If you just take into account East Africa, is about 20%, which is the average of Southeast Asia. So not that bad. The second misleading factor is the non taking into account, or the not taking into account, the informal trade, because most of the goods and services that are actually being traded in Africa are being traded informally, not formally. And the third is that the most integrated value addition in Africa is coming from the financial sector and the telecom sector. And those are integrating above the heads of the states, because the states don't have enough regulatory capacity to actually understand what is going on. You know, because, you know, we have the roaming without any charges in Africa that, you know, Europeans are still, yes, the Europeans are still struggling for. So thank you, Mo, for your contribution. And the same in the financial sector. You know, you have Pan-African banks that go above the heads of the states because the states don't have the regulatory capacity. So I think sometimes we have this picture that is distorted because we don't know the exact level of integration. But this being said, of course, we are far from the integrated markets that we want. And I think we have to struggle for it. And this is a question of implementation. And I think between now and 2017, we have a hell of a challenge to make sure that we are going to be able to do as many dimensions of integration as possible. And I must say here, because I'm in Europe, that the economic partnership agreements are not helping the integration in Africa, because they are being negotiated in a parcel way and creating different mechanisms for different African countries, and is tantamount to the visa issue that you were raising. So yes, you know, Europeans will have a preference with X region that will be different from another, because, you know, they kind of give the incentive that if you do it, you will trade better with us. That's what is happening with the visas as well. So this is not helping then African integration. The second point is about the issue of technology transfer. I would say that, you know, we are past that debate about technology transfer. There is no such a thing anymore as a region is going to transfer technology to another region. That's a debate of the 70s. Today, technology is available. It's a market competitive area. And if you have the money, you go and acquire the technology wherever it is available. It's no longer the property of states. It's no longer the property of a particular owner. The regimes of intellectual property have changed completely, and that's why the global value chains are so important. And that's why we are not going to do import substitution, because before you would produce a good from A to Z in one place. Today that's not possible. Not a single product, not even this bottle of water, is from one to Z produced in the same place. You know, probably part of it is coming from, you know, the paint that is used here in the marketing of it is coming from China, and some of the production is actually done somewhere else in another country, and so on. So this is no longer possible. So when we are going, Africans, to integrate the industrialization process, we are entering a global value chain that is very complex, competitive, and we are going to have a slice of it. And we have to integrate that slice, and we have to identify it country by country. This is not going to happen by continent. And the pharmaceuticals are a very good example. Pharmaceuticals are precisely one good opportunity for Africans to integrate the global value chains, because our market, internal market, is so huge. And right now, we are producing less than 5% of all the medicines that we consume in the continent. And of course, you know, if we just produce it about half, it would be a huge market, and it makes a lot of sense for the pharmaceutical companies to do part of that production in Africa, even if they don't pass us the intellectual property, which probably they wouldn't. And finally, this industrialization is still possible, even with the levels of education that we have right now. Because 40% of the Africans have secondary school. 40% is almost half of the population. That means that if you are going to produce shoes or textiles in factories, and look at the Ethiopia example, it is absolutely possible to do it with the levels of competency that we have right now. That is enough? No, it's not enough. That's where you start. And of course, we want the competencies to be able also to be the producers of patents, to be able to produce our own contributions to intellectual property. And this is, of course, coming with more ability and more capacities. But of course, we should not be negligible about the potential for industrialization that already exists. Look, if we just take everything that is produced in a country like Thailand, it's more than all of the industrial production of Africa right now. Thailand is more than all of Africa. And go there and see what are the levels of competency that exist in Thailand, compare it with all of Africa, including countries like South Africa and the rest, and you'll see that it's a joke that we can't produce more than Thailand. So this is something that we should dispel as a rumor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Very interesting comments. Thank you very much. Mario.
Yes, just to complement what has already been said, because I totally agree with the emphasis that now Carlos is putting on, enough to weigh thinking that there are some prerequisites, and we have to wait to put in place those prerequisites, and then we will act. Obviously, this is a frustrating perspective that does not deserve to be considered. At the same time, I would like to, just looking at other experiences, emphasize two aspects of what I will call the need for industrialization strategies. If you want, in the past, we have put a strong emphasis on industrial policies that were the activity of one ministry, providing incentives to sectors and regulating. I don't think that we have in mind this type of action. I think that what we are discussing today is much different from the 70s, and we are talking about strategies that are the result of different actions, not even of one ministry. In this respect, I do think that the emphasis that we have to put on skills is important, as other areas, not necessarily under the point of view of property rights and research and development at the basic level. I think that what is demonstrated by the experience of development, for example, in China or in Brazil in certain cases, is that it started with low wages and now is upgrading, but also it started with a certain technological capability. Let me emphasize what I mean. I'm not talking about necessarily university diploma. I'm talking about skilled worker. How do we build skilled workers that are capable to permanently upgrade their knowledge of the technology, of the product, and therefore are capable, including in light industries, to permanently modify the product and gain in terms of competitiveness. If I am putting emphasis there, it's not because I think, again, that we need to build a network of university before considering anything else, but together with the industrialization, further invest in how the skills can be developed on the job, not necessarily before, and by the investors, and by relationship between the public sector and the private sector. There are several examples. The German example in OECD is very often quoted when you think to the southern part of Italy, or other examples are the community colleges in the United States where the private sector, the public sector are in the board of directors and they work together. Here I see Daniel Johannes, he knows very well what I'm talking about, and so on. So I think this is an important aspect anyhow to be taken into account under the umbrella of what you said. No? We can start from now. A second point that I would like to emphasize, because we are speaking a lot about trade, and I think you want to come back on the question of inclusiveness of growth. I will not touch on that for the moment, but I think that we are emphasizing very often the aspect related with tariff barriers or even non-tariff barriers. Whilst it was already said here, it's very easy to verify that infrastructure plays a much more important role in the capacity of integration of markets than this matter. Not to oppose one to the other, but let me repeat that tariff barrier or transport costs are 8 times a component of prices of African goods than the tariff barriers. And the reason is very easy to explain. When you produce commodities, the value added per kilo is very low, and therefore the transport cost affect very much the value. On the other hand, when you produce fresh goods, you need to deliver quickly. If not, you are incapable to do. And more, some market for exports, like the European one, are requiring the just-in-time, and therefore this element in our strategy is important. I am tackling this point because I want to answer the question of Madame Zuma. How can we practically identify the component of the implementation of our work? Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Madame Zuma, so Mario said, and Carlos too, no time to waste. There are no preconditions. The takeoff, the industrial takeoff, can take place now. Would you answer that? And also, there were some very, very important questions to you about African unity and talent.
Yes, and I agree. There are no preconditions. It could have taken off 10 years ago. So that's not a problem. But I also don't agree that because it can take off today, you delay the other areas. My view is that you need all the skills from the top end to the low end, and you must develop them all now. Whilst we can start with what we have, but we have to start now developing the high-end skills so that we can get to the innovation, so that we can get to the high-end skills as well. So I think it's not either or, it's do all of them at the same time, just like you have primary school, high school, higher education, you have post-degree. We need the lot in Africa. We have enough young people to occupy all those levels. That would be my view. So yes, we can start now, but let's skill our people in every area, so that we can also develop our own technologies as we go along through innovation. The question of NEPAD, my problem with NEPAD, which I've always said, even when I was foreign minister, was that we developed a plan and we expected other people to bring technology. We expected other people to bring resources. Doesn't happen. You develop your own plan. You plan how you're going to implement it yourself, and other people come in to join. So I think for me, that was a big problem of NEPAD. Our heads of state trooped along to all these G8 meetings from one to the other. Each G8 capital deciding what the agenda is going to be, and we were all there going around, and I'm not sure what we've got to show for it. But I think it was a good lesson to learn, and we should not repeat it. There was a question about growth for who. I think that's a very important question. Because if it's growth just for the numbers to show the GDP, it may not be as useful. It is actually the growth that must ensure that eventually we eradicate poverty, which therefore it means it's the growth for the people. Not only eradicate extreme poverty, as I hear people talk. I think from my point of view, as Africans, we just don't want to be poor. We want to work hard eventually to eradicate poverty. Because when we talk about eradicating extreme poverty, our young people are asking us, are you saying it's fine to be poor as long as we're not extremely poor? Is that what you are working on with the rest of the world, that we must be poor, but not extremely poor? They are not accepting that, and I agree with them. So we must work, do everything in the end for the benefit of our people. There was a question on conflicts, car, and all that. I think Mo talked about the type of conflicts we have now. And I think part of the problem with the conflicts is our own approach and the approach of the world. Because we approach it, I've had many people tell me, we must deal with conflicts first because there can't be development without conflict. And I think that's wrong. If there are conflicts in 3 countries, why do you stop development in the 51? And only do, everybody must now concentrate on the conflict in the 3 countries and ignore the 51. By the time you have dealt with the 3, the youth is restless in the others, and they are starting their own instability because they don't have jobs, they don't have education, they don't have anything. So what is important is to understand that yes, where there is conflict, we must deal with and deal with expeditiously. But we must attend to issues of modernization, of development, of infrastructure in all the other countries. Because you will not sustain peace if you ignore development. It will not be sustainable. So we have to do both. But I also want us to give due where it's due. You know, we give credit where it's due. Yes, we have conflicts in Africa. One of the examples was used was car. Car, by December last year, the whole world was crying, there's going to be genocide if nothing is done. There's going to be genocide in car if nothing was done. But the world didn't do anything. Africans did something. Of course, France, which was there, also worked with them. But we all cried genocide, didn't do anything. Not even the Security Council, which is responsible for our collective security in the world, did anything. They said, like we all know, the UN only comes to keep peace. It doesn't come where there is no peace. It was the African men and women who sacrificed life and limb in car from December up to the 15th of September, when the UN felt comfortable enough that there is now peace to keep. And they came and reheaded, and now we have a UN peacekeeping. And I think Africans actually do a lot to deal with the conflicts. We don't have a conflict in Africa that rages for years. People being killed, destruction of property. African leaders rally and ensure that the conflict is as short-lived as possible. So I think we are doing well. But of course, we want to silence the guns. We don't want to have the conflicts. But when they do happen, we do take care. And this was because we realized that if we leave it to the UN or the Security Council, we might have our conflicts raging on for 5 years, 3 years, with nothing happening. And I will say this because I've said this to the Security Council when I was in my previous jobs, that we also see that when it's Africa, they walk very slowly like an elephant. Maybe when it's somewhere else where it really matters, they splint like a cheetah. So we've decided we'll sprint like cheetahs. We may not have all the resources, but we sprint like cheetahs to try and contain our conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Zuma.
There was just one other question around Rex, I think.
We'll take it in the second round. Yeah. The gentleman who had a question on Ebola. Now, my advice to all people who ask questions is keep it short. That way you're certain to get an answer. If you ramble on, people turn off and the question gets lost in the mist. So there was a gentleman who wanted a question on Ebola. If you could just identify yourself, please, and keep it precise. Thank you.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. I introduced myself earlier. I'm Simon Tedka. And the question I have on Ebola is, first of all, an observation. I would like to thank Mrs. Zuma for saying herself that if Africa is to develop, we need health and we need education. We do now have an Ebola problem. You might correct this, but I don't think the African Union's response to this was sufficient. The amount was only a couple million dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. So does that mean the African Commission is not attending health issues? Have we been waiting for Ebola to happen to suddenly respond? The second question I have is, since Ebola is causing as many casualties as a war, we're up to 3,000 by now, and we know there'll be more, do heads of state, and not only the heads of state of the affected countries, have they been doing anything to put an end to this epidemic, which will be which will have a high cost for Africa? We're talking...
Thank you very much. Sir, your question has been asked, and it's very, very good.
Merci.
Please, thank you very much indeed. I have a lady over there. Please, can the microphone go to the lady there? She's standing up now. Thank you.
Thanks for the micro. So I'm 49. I'm the challenger of Mr. Nicolas Sarkozy because I was candidate to the head of the French Conservative Party in France. Just about my knowledge about Africa, I know just the north part, but what I'm very thankful. Excusez-moi, je vais parler français. Oui.
Excuse me, I'll switch into French, but I am very aware of what has been going on in Morocco. Ms. Zuma just mentioned the United Nations, but Morocco and the United Nations created an alliance of civilizations with Hubert Védrine for a reference think tank on reflection on religion to train imams in Mali and Nigeria, where Mr. Goodluck is a member of Mr. Moon's North Korean church, and they played on words such as bringing back good luck or similar. And many opposition figures in Nigeria are complaining of this North Korean Thatcherite church or Bush-like church. Excuse me, could you go to the question, please? Yes, well, it's the only think tank in French-speaking Africa. I know there's another one in Ethiopia, and I wish these research centers, and it's the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations with, and Mr. Desmond Tutu is a member of it, and I hope they could be more active. So your question was about the Alliance of Civilization. Thank you very much.
Sorry? Well, what do you think of Alliance of Civilizations? You have to be a bit more patient. Please put up your hand or stand up.
Thank you. Josie D'Angelo. I used to run the DAC chairman's office from 1999 to 2006, and probably some of you recognize me. I left to work on Africa. During the time I was with the Development Assistance Chair, we came up with the Millennium Goals, we came up with financing development, we came up with Glen Eagles, we came up with a number of other subjects. I'm very happy today to see, Your Excellency, the African Union partnering with the OECD. It's something that should have been done for me a very long time ago. But I'm very pleased to see, and as Her Excellency, Madame Zuma said, we need concrete results, not just discussion and policies. from policies to practical.
Sorry, madam, but I need your question.
Yes, my question is, we spoke about the private sector, the informal sector. I worked in OECD on the Initiative for Central Africa, where we worked on the Great Lakes region for 3 years. It was a program that we were working with the miners, we were developing, we were putting skills, we were putting things into place. It was stopped here, this program. This was something I think was very important. I have since worked with the African Union in various areas.
So your question is about the private sector,
private
or
sector,
the informal sector?
And the skills for the women in the private sector.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, gentleman over here, please. I can take about, if you're short, if you're brief, I can take 3 questions. If not, I'll just take 2. Please, can I ask for brevity?
Yes, my name is Irambo. I will be very short. There are 14 African countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. They are facing serious problems regarding the development and the industrialization. In Madame Zuma's Agenda 26, can we expect at that time that those countries will gain their financial independence? Because, as we know, there are 14 of them where they are having serious problems. I know that the finance problems are sometimes taboo, and people really don't like to speak about that.
But you have, so thank you very much indeed. I have, thank you very much. I see a hand right at the back, and then another one there, please. Could you stand up right at the back? No, sorry, I will give them, just right at the back, yes, please. Yes?
Bonjour.
Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself? My name is Marla Zavantali. I'm an independent observer here. And I would like to know what the African Union is doing regarding changes in political leadership. We know that today in Africa, the same people have been heading our countries for the last 20 or 30 years. There is no change in political leadership. There are no new ideas. So what is the African Union actually doing to solve this problem and encourage younger leaderships in governance?
Now I'll take a question with the gentleman in the blue shirt. You know, this is a day-long conference. This is a conference that goes on all day. So you will have ample chance to ask your questions. If you could be brief, I have a question here as well.
Thank you. Patrick Worms from the World Agroforestry Center. We're a research institution based in Nairobi. One statistic. In Mozambique, 80% of the population is composed of smallholder farmers. In Mozambique, only 2% of government spending goes towards developing this economic sector. This is an extreme example, but it reflects a reality which is common across sub-Saharan Africa. Smallholders are the economic backbone of the continent. They produce most of its food, and they are broadly ignored. And yet, the history of development, be it in Europe or East Asia, shows that apart from city-states, no country on earth has ever managed to develop unless it first invested in its smallholder farmers. So my question to the panel is, to the economists, do you share that analysis, and what would you recommend the African Union and the OECD do to promote that agenda? And to the business leaders and head of African Union, do you share that analysis, and what would you expect the private sector and the developed world to do to help you achieve that objective? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Gentleman right in front here, please, if you could bring the microphone. Yes. Yes, right. Sir, could you put up your hand? Yeah.
Hello, bonjour. C'est Gono.
Good morning. My name is Mr. Mustafa. I'm an economist, and my question is to Carlos. Is it a good idea to use the Latin American industrialization model, considering that African economies aren't open to the world yet?
And that's the last question from this round. Short and sweet, please.
My name is Mrs. Dameda Josefa. I'm a pharmacist, and I'd like to add on to the question on Ebola. It's not the first time we're facing this Ebola outbreak. I think the first time was 1956, and I would like to know, what have we tried to do up until now? I mean, prior to these new outbreaks. And the second question is, does the African population have access to the drugs required to cure this virus? And even if it's an experimental treatment, can the African population access it?
Your questions are great, but please keep them for the panelists to come. Mrs. Zuma, if I could ask you to start off with the questions on Ebola. I also had one to ask you on that, actually. You said Africans can sprint like cheetahs when it comes to peacekeeping. On Ebola, what has the reaction been like from African states and the international community? And of course, the two questions from our participants here.
Yeah, I think we should not put the conflicts together with Ebola. I think when we discuss conflicts, we should discuss conflicts. When you discuss Ebola, let's discuss Ebola. Because why we have a peace and security architect at the AU is because we needed it, because we are being failed by the international community in terms of finding solutions for our conflicts. So we develop an architect. When it comes to health, the international organization that is responsible for health internationally, especially outbreaks and so on, is the World Health Organization. So I think the first question must go to how much did the World Health Organization sprint and how much did it do on Ebola? That's what we should be looking at. But as Africans, even though it's not our international responsibility, these countries are in Africa. We felt it was our responsibility to do something in addition to whatever else everybody was doing. And let me say, even though it's not the first time, it is the first time that Ebola is not in a remote, isolated area, either in the DRC or in Uganda or around that region. West Africa has never had Ebola before. And Ebola has not spread in the urban areas as it has done this time before. And I think we had, in a way, when the outbreak happens in DRC or Uganda, because it happens in very isolated areas, there are ways of containing it, and it has always been contained. It has never spread to the extent that it has in West Africa. And I think because it was the first time, obviously everybody was taken by surprise, because it has never happened there. Secondly, it was happening in countries that were fragile before Ebola itself, did not have strong institutions, so did not have a strong response, public health response to the epidemic. But also, some of the people were not necessarily even using the health services as the first point of call. They were using traditional services sometimes. So it is, for all intents and purposes, the first time that we have a situation like this. And of course, the AU, yes, we may say we did not have an adequate response, but as I say, the first response should come from WHO. But Africans themselves, I'll be very honest with you, some of the countries did not act appropriately. They panicked. They closed the borders. They slapped travel bans from people from those countries. They stopped flights. So what then the AU did in that situation, we called an emergency meeting of ministers of Foreign Affairs and Health, so that we could discuss and have a common understanding of the disease and a collective and coordinated response. And we agreed that those responses were not appropriate. We shouldn't be closing borders. We shouldn't be having travel bans. We should reintroduce the flights. But we also agreed that it was very important to have proper screening at exit and on arrival. For people who depart from those countries, there should be proper screening so that people who are ill should not travel whilst they are ill. But also in the receiving countries, all our countries had to put measures in place to screen so that if somebody arrives and they have a problem, they are able to be treated. We don't have access to any drugs. There are no drugs that are official that actually treat the disease. So Africans at this point in time don't have access to them. There are experimental serums and so on, but we don't have access. That's a short answer to that. But we are learning from this experience, and we must turn it into an opportunity to see what can be done. How can we strengthen our services? How can we strengthen our public health services going forward? And then on the question of political leadership, or political alternance. Yes, maybe there was one on informal training for women. I think that's very important. We aren't doing enough. We must do enough. We must do more and more. So that's the answer. Then there was the question of political leadership, that all our leaders have been in leadership since time immemorial. That was the essence of the question. First, that question is not that statement is not accurate. The majority of countries in Africa actually are having elections and are having change of leadership. And I'm sure Mo can attest to that with his surveys. There may be a few countries where people have stayed. But if you look at those countries, let's take, for instance, Angola. President Dos Santos has been there for quite some time. But Angola was besieged with war. He had to make sure that the country gets out of war. And indeed, if you visit Luanda today or Angola today, the 10 years from the time the war ended, there is a big difference. Basic needs are being provided to people, housing, infrastructure. A lot is being done. So I don't think we should just say we must change for the sake of changing because somebody else across some ocean is saying so. I think in Angola, I can see, I've visited Angola over years, but I can see a lot that is happening. And you sit with them, we sit with President Dos Santos, he'll tell you exactly what they are doing to improve the lives of the people after the war, and you can see it with your eyes. So I'm saying for the majority is not true. And some of the constitutions do not say that you have to be there for 2 terms, just like some of the constitutions here in Europe do not say so. And members of the OECD, they are in 3rd terms and 4th terms if the political situation allows. So I don't think necessarily everything should be one size fits all. But there are situations in Africa where the situation maybe should change. And that you see from the people themselves in that country. And where the people want change, I think there should be change. I think you've covered. I've covered most things.
Covered most of the ground.
Yes. And there was a question specifically about whether we agree that smallholder farmers should be assisted.
Right, that would be the final one.
I agree that smallholder farmers should be assisted. You talked about Mozambique. In fact, this forum of 34 universities who deal with agriculture on the continent were meeting in Mozambique this July. I attended them, and they spoke at length precisely about that point. And people from outside should be part of assisting smallholder farmers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Zuma. I'm going to turn now actually to Mo, because I think we need to continue with this discussion on African leadership, and you, of course, are the eminent grise on governance issues. Do you think Mrs. Zuma is right in saying no change for change's sake?
No, I don't agree with her on that point. We're not talking about change for change sake, but what we're talking about due process. And it is very important really to have a process. And just like anything in life, presidents after 2 terms or so would have run out of ideas, and there's nothing new. And by installing these rules, we always need to have a refresh. We need to refresh the idea. I'm a little bit surprised, frankly, that my sister leapt to the defense of a certain country in Africa. Okay.
Mrs. Zuma, I'll give you the microphone in a second. If Mo could finish, and then I'll give you the floor.
Okay. I think maybe a few things in Angola are indefensible, frankly, especially corruption and transparency, if we're going to name names. I think it was unfair really to ask you that question because of your formal position. I'm unemployed, so it's easy for me to speak about these issues. I agree with you that the majority of African countries have democratic transition of power. That's correct. I agree with you that there is improvement in the standard of governance in Africa. That's correct. There are still few buckets around. And we should not be surprised by the beautiful, towns, roads, etc. If you go to Equatorial Guinea for a conference, of course, it's a beautiful city because huge wealth of oil, etc. Big GDP, but largest number of poor people in Africa, percentage-wise, because the wealth is not divided equity, because the president and his son taken most of it, frankly. And so we have to name, we really need to be honest and brutally frank on these issues. Whenever we have corruption, whenever we have people amassing wealth out of their country's pockets, they think they own the country. You rule, you are servant to the country, you don't own the country. And we have a number of leaders around who think they own the countries. But as I always say, we don't brush all of Africa with that brush. We have few buckets, and we need to, of course, raise that issue. But in general, we have a lot of democratic process going on. One area I'll speak quite a lot about it is the fact we have at least 2 presidents who are starting a new term when they are 90 years old. I think for a continent where the majority of people are below 20 years old, to have people at 90 years old starting a new term, I think a little bit too much, really. I mean, I see you even laughing. You know it is not true, but I'm not asking you for a comment because of your position. And you can see, I mean, these guys even, I mean, what can you do? If you are an engineer, if you are a teacher, if you are a doctor, if you are anything, when you reach 65, you say you need to retire. I understand here in France, you're always fighting to retire too early, but that's your problem. But elsewhere, we all retire at 65 are told they are too old. We have to retire. Why a president at 90 years old cannot retire? Is running a country such a trivial job that when you are even half functioning, you can do it like that? What is it? So there must be really a little bit, we have to be frank and have this kind of discussion. I know it is not very polite. It's not very nice in this kind of, people to raise these issues. But it's time really to be honest and name things by their names. Okay, so that's where we stand. Thank you.
Mo, I just have, as Africa's best known unemployed person, I have a question for you, and then I'll turn to you, Mrs. Zuma. What is your vision of 2063 in Africa? 3 things that you would like to see happening between now and then.
It's not just a vision, I am sure.
Okay.
2063 will see the United States of Africa. We'll see a continent matching China. I think so. We have the capacity, we have the resources, and we have a new generation of young people who is not like us. We are a corrupt elite of people. We are a product of the colonial system. Yeah? And we sold out. We sold out, frankly. But these new young people coming, they are uncompromising. They are better educated than us. They are better connected than us. Everybody of them working with his, gadget and stuff. They're very well organized. They watch all this television. When I grow up, I have only one TV to watch. That's the official TV of the Sudan government, run by the president, and I just, every morning I see what he had for breakfast, what he had for lunch, whom he meet. This is my knowledge of the world. That's why I'm so ignorant. But this young generation, they have thousands of channels. They have the web. They read all the newspapers. It's different kind of. Those are the guys who are going to produce the new Africa, and because we need to have a new Africa, and we need to be very clear about this. As for us, well, we are not really have done a very good job, unfortunately.
You wanted to come in, Mrs. Zuma, but also, I mean, you can now have your vision as well. It's a nice moment to your final wrap-up words. The new vision for 2063.
Well, we are
shorter than the one you said before.
It's a prosperous, integrated, people-centered Africa, peaceful, with women and youth at the forefront. But I think in a dialogue like this, we should dialogue. We should exchange ideas. I actually don't agree that the older leaders of Africa did not do anything. They were just a corrupt branch. I wouldn't be here if that was the case. I grew up under apartheid. And it was those leaders that fought to make us free. I'll talk about my country and my region. And if they did not, we would still be under the yoke of apartheid. And it was Africans, and it was ordinary people in Western Europe, not governments were with the apartheid regime, but it was ordinary people who joined anti-apartheid and fought with us. So it would be actually a disgrace to their memory to say they were just a corrupt bunch that did nothing. They freed Africa. Others sacrificed the Lumumbas. Congo is still in trouble, but Patrice Lumumba we know. So I think we should not get carried away and start brushing everybody. Yes, there may have been corrupt people. There are corrupt people here in Europe, across the world, there are corrupt people. But not everybody is corrupt. Even in Africa, not everybody is corrupt. There are corrupt people just like there are corrupt people here and everywhere.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Zuma. That's exactly why there's an international accord to fight graft and corruption. It's not just limited to a region or a continent. Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Zuma. I'll turn now to Carlos, and then I'll give the final word to Mario. As always.
Well, I'm going to be very brief. I was enjoying this exchange. And, you know, when Mo said that, you know, his generation, I said, I'm not from your generation. I'm coming after. But I absolutely agree with the memory. If I look for inspiration, the names that come to me are the names of the heroes of African independence. And I think those are the inspiration that will make us fight. For the record, by the way, Mo, Angola has the best record on reduction poverty in Africa in the last decade. Just for the record. I think it's important that financial independence. No. I'm just saying for the record.
Let's just say countries are multifaceted.
It's complex. It's complex. On financial independence, I will just give an insight because it encapsulates the debate somehow. Very often, people refer to African countries are very poor in terms of their management. They have natural resources, but they have not been able to do much out of the natural resources. And there is a lot of truth in it, in the sense that we need better negotiating capacity. We need all the issues that we have been discussing today, value addition, and using our commodities as an entry point for industrialization. That's basically very different from the Latin American model, if we want to use the Latin American model as a contrast. And also, the times are very different. But I like always to point out to the fact that there is no country that develops without natural resources. There is no country. Which means that you can develop with the natural resources you have or the natural resources that you steal. But there is no country that develops without natural resources. Thank you.
Conclusion means thanking you because you helped us in going through a very interesting discussion, and also emphasizing the word that have been said during this last session. I want to thank Madame Zuma because when she referred to the important leader of Africa, she mentioned also that here in Europe, there were people defending also that tradition. As I happened to be born between the First and the Second Punic War, in my young period, I was in the street also to support those leaders. And I think it's a tradition that we all share, at least on this side of the table. And on this base, how can we continue these efforts and this tradition? This was the question of this session and the question of the forum as a whole. And I think it's very important what has been said now by Carlos and by the question addressing Latin America. Can we use the example of Latin America for Africa? I don't think we can't. I don't think we can't use the example of Europe for Latin America and Africa, or the one of Southeast Asia. What we can do is to share our experience, to share the policy we have put in place, to know, for example, that sometimes is not that sometimes, that always is crucial to help the small farmers, but at the same time to remember that what needs to be developed are rural areas and not only the farmers. There are a lot of non-farm employment that needs to be developed. If not, we continue to be cut off in this debate, urbanization versus agriculture. No, it's urbanization with strong rural areas what we need in order to avoid the big concentration in metropolitan areas that are a new source of issue and problem. All these examples are fields in which we can share our experience. Obviously, we can discuss, be opposed, try to avoid violent objection, but anyhow express our objection. That's the role that we want to have all together here, and that's why we are so happy to have organized this forum together with the Africa Union and with the traditional friends of Carlos and Ibrahim. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mario. We can't get up just yet. Mrs. Zuma wants to say something very, very briefly, and I'm going to concede this
very
to
briefly,
her.
just for the record. I said an ordinary people in Western Europe, but I must say Prime Minister Olof Palme and the Scandinavian countries later on joined and supported us. So just for the record.
Okay. Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of this very fascinating journey through Africa's economic transformation. We've talked about Factory Asia, global value chains, industrial policy, but also, crucially, of African leadership and the Ebola pandemic. Okay, yes, and yes, and Mo is right. So please join me in giving a big applause to our panelists. Thank you very much indeed. And to all of you for your questions as well. Thank you.
Just a minute. We're now going to lunch.
Mesdames, Messieurs, je vous invite maintenant à...
We're now going to lunch, as I was trying to say. That's on the ground floor. Go up the escalators, and there will be people to show you to the chateau, where there is a lunch for everybody, and we'll be back here at 1:30. There'll be two sessions, one Africa's role in globalization, and the other one demographics and territorial development. Thank you.
African sky blue, African